Hello of everyone who's joined this morning. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the first of our two-part webinar series. My name is Richard McDonald. I'm the head of customer success here at EverGive. So my role is all about making sure that our charity partners and our donors achieve success. So for donors, that means seeing their generosity have real impact, knowing the support they're giving is reaching the causes they care about and actually making a difference on the ground. And then for charities, success often means building reliable and sustainable income that allows them to plan with confidence, invest in long-term projects, and maximize the good they can do in their communities. So part of my job is to help connect those two sides. And today's session is very much about understanding how Bitcoin fits into that bigger picture. So for today's session, we're going to look at the history of money, how it began as a tool to store, account for, and exchange value, how different forms of hard and soft money have shaped economies, and what happens when money is debased. From there, we'll move on to Bitcoin, and we'll explore what Bitcoin actually is, why it's considered the hardest money ever invented, and some of the key benefits it brings, particularly in the way it gives people more equal access and creates fairer playing field for everyone. This will help set up the scene for our second webinar, which is this time next week, and that's where we'll focus more specifically on how Bitcoin is being used in practice. We'll hear again from Groundswell project about how Bitcoin supports their mission, and our co-founder will also share why EverGive exists. And that session will also include a Q&A. So today's session should last around 40 to 45 minutes. As we go along, please do jot down any questions you might have. We'll be gathering those after this session, and then with that, we can use those to prepare some thoughtful answers for our next session. So without further ado, I'm delighted to be joined today by Gafar from the Groundswell project, who I'll hand over to now, and he can introduce himself and kick us off. So over to you, Gafar.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for that introduction. So my name is Gafar Hussain. I'm currently Managing Director at the Groundswell project. We are a community building and peace building organization that seeks to build more resilient communities to make them resilient against all sorts of social harms. One thing we've identified in recent years is financial resilience is also important and very, very central to people's lives. And Bitcoin can play a key role in building financial resilience within a British domestic community context, but also with some of the people who work around the world. So that's who we are. That's our involvement in Bitcoin. So today might come across a bit like a history presentation because a lot of it is about history. But essentially, I want to talk about what money is, how the current financial system that we have evolved, what the weaknesses are with that system, and why Bitcoin can fix a lot of these issues. So if we just go to the first slide, please, Yuto. So having done this presentation with communities before, it's good to just start by asking what is money, because money is something. When we're born, money's just there; it's around us, right? We kind of live in society, and money's just a thing. We don't really stop and think, what is money? What does it represent? What is this technology called money? How did it evolve? Why was it needed? What problems is it trying to solve? Are there alternative ways of having money? These aren't things that are talked about generally, and aren't things we think about. And also, curiously, it's never mentioned in school. It's a conversation I've heard of many people I spoke to in central government over the years. Like, why aren't we taught about money? In school, that's such an important part of our lives. Yet, certainly, the schooling I had, money just wasn't really mentioned in the basics of it. So, if you think about the concept of money, and it's important to do this before we get to Bitcoin. What is money? Like, what's the idea behind money? Now, if we look at the historical record, we can see that humans have, from a very early stage, certainly when humans settled, even before they settled perhaps, have had the need to exchange and trade with each other. So if I have 20 bananas and someone has apples, and I want some of that person's apples, I might want to give my bananas for the apples, right? So in this context, my bananas are now money in this specific context. And that's that was probably the first way in which humans did trade with each other. They exchanged goods for like and like. The problem with that, and the problem with that emerged very early, is that requires a coincidence of wants. Like the person I'm giving the bananas to has to want my bananas to give me their apples. What if they don't want my bananas? I can't get their apples now, right? So I have to give them something that they want, right? It could be a pineapple. Or if they don't want fruit, because they've got plenty of fruit. What if they don't want to eat fruit, and that fruit's going to go off after a certain point? So this led to humans developing a thing that can store value, right? What's the thing that can store value across time, right? So it can't just be a fruit that someone might not want. It's got to be something that someone will always want and someone can keep for a certain point in time, and someone can then exchange themselves for something else, or they can use it for a specific purpose, right? But that's basically what money is. So money evolved for this need amongst humans to exchange, store, and account for value, right? So the three things you can see on the screen there. Money is a store of value. It's a store of labor. So someone's working for you, you can give them something in return for that, which is them storing their value, you storing the value, the fruits of your labor, being able to exchange that value for something that you want, and then using that value to account for things. So you can say, this horse is worth, say, 20 of these things over here. So you can account, you can basically judge the value of things based on this thing called money. You can exchange it for goods, and you can store value. You can store your labor. You can create value and store that value and exchange it with other people and time. So basically, trade and our basic ability to survive as human beings relies on a conception of money. So every society on the planet throughout history, societies that have had no connection with each other, have developed some form of money, just as they developed some form of language or food or clothes. So it's such an essential part of the human condition to have something that stores value and through which you can exchange value, right? So that essentially is what money is. So we have this idea. So we move from a bartering system to a system where we develop different forms of money. And if you go to the next slide, please, Uto. So over history, different things have acted as money over time, right? And it's important to understand this part, because through understanding this, we start understanding why some money is good money and some money is not so good, or some money is hard money and some money is soft money. We start understanding the properties of money by looking at the different human experiments that we've had with money. So there's lots of examples of this. You know, those seashells were used for money because they were considered, you know, precious and rare. Large stones in the past were used for money. Many things have been used for money. But by looking at these examples, we can understand why certain forms of money are better than others. So salt's a very interesting example. Salt was traditionally, and today we associate obviously salt mainly with, you know, putting a bit of salt on your food. But essentially, salt historically was a preservative. So if you wanted to preserve food, you'd need a bit of salt and water essentially to preserve it. So it was very valuable. It's also very rare to get salt in inland areas. It's only found in areas by the sea or the ocean. So salt had a lot of value. And what started happening, I think, in like many things in China from sort of 3000 before Common Era, they made basically salt cakes. They compact a lot of salt into a little cake, and that essentially became money. People would trade salt with each other because highly valuable. Everyone recognizes its value. Great way of storing value, has a real world purpose, i.e. to put on your food or to use to store and preserve food over time. So much so that the Roman army actually paid soldiers in salt, and that's where the word salary comes from, basically. It's salarium, which is based on those who receive salt. In Venice, it was described as white gold. That's how precious salt was. And you got expressions like he's worth one's weight in, worth one's salt. This person's worth his salt, right? Because people were paid in salt. So you've got these expressions that come from that. So over time, the problem with salt was when societies became more advanced, it became easy to produce salt on a much larger scale, industrial production of salt, for example. So therefore, salt lost its value because it was so ubiquitous, so easily available. So over time, it lost its value because it was never that rare. It was just that the conditions at that time allowed it to be rare. Also, what kept it scarce at the time was monopolization on trade routes. So prior to the Portuguese sailing around Africa and developing trade routes with Latin America and India and China, all trade in Europe had to come through Venice and Genoa, and it was controlled by, you know, a few sort of Italian trade hubs, which controlled the amount of salt that could come into Europe. So that kind of created inflated the value of salt, if you like. So that monopoly was eventually smashed. Salt became ubiquitous, and over time, people use salt a lot less. This is a story with many forms of money. So glass beads, for example, you can see the picture of the glass beads there. So glass beads was a form of money in West Africa, places like Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, etc. Now, in these parts of the world, in these countries, the gold was an artisan trade. It was very difficult to manually get the ingredients to create a glass bead, right? Which was colorful and had patterns and designs. And these were very durable, so they'd last a long period of time. They were easy to transport. and they symbolized status and wealth because they were considered rare. If you walked around with a necklace that had glass beads on it, that would symbolize that you have power and wealth and status, and tribal leaders would have this, for example, right? So that became a form of money for a long period of time. Again, it's something that could store value, something to exchange value. But when the Europeans turned up, they were able to make glass beads in factories on a mass scale and then go to Africa and flood the market with them, right? So very quickly it became less valuable because it was suddenly so easy to produce, and it became less artisan and more of something that could be done industrially. So over time, the value of glass beads declined. Things like teeth, animal teeth, were also used as forms of money again, in parts of Africa and other parts of the world as well. Again, problem with that, there were status symbols, they were hard to get, but it wasn't really very scalable. It was harder to break them down into smaller units, for example, when it's just a whole tooth. So again, it lasted for a certain period of time. Tea, by the way, that image I made, that is tea. That's not weed or anything. In case I was thinking, that is compacted tea. So compacted tea cakes, or called compressed tea bricks. Again, tea was very valuable historically. Only grew in certain parts of China at the time, and at the time, many leaders controlled how much tea was actually grown. So the market was never flooded with tea, and because it only grown in specific regions, in places like Tibet and Mongolia, it was very, very precious. So a compacted tea brick was also used as a somewhat form of money. Again, it had a real world use. You could actually just brew it as a drink. It was divisible. You could take a few leaves off and give it. It was obviously a consumer product, limited production, obviously later mass produced. When the British got to India, they learned about tea. They took that to when they got to China. The tea was produced in India on scale, in Sri Lanka and other parts of the world. Eventually, tea was produced everywhere, so no value for tea. Now, they've got tulips at the bottom. So somebody might be thinking, what's tulips got to do with this? But Amsterdam, in Holland, sorry, I should say, in the 16th and 15th century, we had the world's first financial bubble. And it's built on what's called tulip mania. It's really interesting to read about this. Essentially, tulips became a luxury item amongst rich Dutch people. And again, status symbol that you're wealthy, symbol that you're doing well. So people started investing in futures contracts. So, I'm going to pay now for a product that will be delivered in October or later in the year, hoping that by that time, the value's gone up and I'd have made money. I can just get it back and sell it. So tulip contracts became a form of money, right? And what happened is over time, people rushed into this to make money and it became a bubble. The whole thing exploded. The price of tulips collapsed. A lot of people lost money. It became a kind of a speculative bubble, essentially. So I can go on, but there's many forms, many examples of things that have been used as money over the years. And as we've seen with the examples given, there's certain qualities that allow something to be good money or strong money or hard money, whatever term you want to use, and certain qualities that allow it to be weaker money, right? What humans essentially discovered during this period of experimentation was gold and silver were probably the best forms of money because they were rare, they were scarce, they're very durable, they're not likely to go off like a food item can. And they were, highly accepted. You could divide it into smaller and smaller blocks. It fulfilled a lot of the criteria for good money. So this is why most humans over time standardized on gold and silver. If you go to the next slide, please, Peter. So this then leads us to a discussion about what is good money and what is bad money, right? What's strong and what is hard money. I've got 6 things there on the slide. Essentially, for a money to survive, and thrive and become widely acceptable and it needs certain qualities. It's got to be scarce. It can't be something that's widely abundant because people don't value anything. Generally, humans, we don't value things that are abundant. We value scarcity. It's got to be divisible because we want to be able to do purchases at different levels, right? We want to be able to buy a house and also buy a packet of crisps. So something's going to be divisible at different levels. It's got to be durable. It's got to be something that's going to go off after a month, or it's going to be, just disintegrate over time, for example. It's got to be something that lasts a long period of time. And that reminds me of a story, actually, because Pablo Escobar, the famous Colombian drug lord, stored a lot of his money in dollar notes. And I think 15% of all his money was eaten by rodents. So I think he lost £1.5 million through animals, basically chewing his dollar notes. So it's got to be durable, something that can last, over the centuries, something you can pass on. It's got to be fungible, which means each one's got to be the same as the other one, right? So if I'm trading in pineapples, but one's bigger and riper, that's going to have more value than the one that's smaller and less ripe, right? So it's not fungible. Whereas if I issued gold tokens and they all were exactly the same weight and size, they're fungible. So fungibility is very important with money. Portability. Now, this is again a more modern thing now, because in the past it probably wasn't such an issue to be able to send money around the world, but today we do transactions globally in a globalized economy. So it's got to be portable, something you can send quite easily. Again, one of the downsides of money, if I was sending you, of gold, if I was sending you a block of gold, and people found out that a block of gold is being transported, suddenly you're a target for someone to rob you, right? So that creates issues there. So portability, and with that you could add security as well. Being able to securely send something over a distance or a long distance is a very important aspect of money. And acceptability, people want what you're giving them. So if I started going to Tesco and trying to pay the cashier in apples, they'd be like, no, I want money, mate. So it's got to be acceptable. It's got to be something that people want and people value and accept. So we have this as a sort of broad criteria for what is good or bad money. We can see why some of the other experiments with money failed. We can see why salt didn't take off. We can see why, ivory horns didn't take off, or teeth, or glass beads. We can see why some of the things didn't take off, because they didn't fulfill some of these criteria. So gold and silver became considered the strongest form of money, which is many of the empires, like the Roman Empire, other empires built their empire on the back of gold and silver. So should we go to the next slide, please? So we're now going to talk about the downsides of that as well. So the Romans obviously had the denarii. Oh, sorry, do you want to go back? Sorry, the Romans had the denarii, which was essentially a high purity silver coin. And this is what the Roman Empire was built on. Obviously, it's a large empire. There's a lot of silver mines. They confiscated silver wherever they went. And the soldiers were paid in silver, which was very valuable at the time as well. But what happened with the Roman Empire? This began in sort of 64 CE with Nero. So Nero inherited a pretty bad situation. Previous to him was Caligula and Claudius. So obviously Caligula, as you famously know, went a bit mad and started doing crazy construction projects which made no sense. He's eventually killed by his own soldiers. But there's also a great fire at the time in Rome as well. So Nero inherited a situation where a lot of reconstruction was needed. A lot of building projects were going on. There was a few debts. And also a campaign to conquer Britannia as well, the UK around that time. So in order to deal with the situation, what Nero started doing is debasing the currency. So essentially the purity of the silver coin. So let's say a coin is 97% silver. It'd suddenly be 96% silver. And the year after that, it'd be 94% silver. And then slowly, the amount of actual silver in the coin was slowly being reduced. And this is the way of saving on their silver without reducing the face value of the coin. So as far as the public are concerned, the coin is still worth what it should be worth, but the actual value of silver is slowly being eroded and filled with copper and other cheaper metal. Now, and the other thing that started happening, by the way, is coin clipping. So if you go to a museum and you see a collection of Roman coins, you find that they're all quite different shapes and sizes. Now, I thought that was just how they were made at the time when I was younger, but I realized what people did is actually clip a bit of the coin and keep it, which is why if you look at modern coins, there's sort of ridges around the edge, and that those ridges are designed to ensure that the coin hasn't been clipped, essentially. That's where the ridges came from. But anyway, I digress. Over time, what happened was, as the currency was being debased, which was, as far as the Romans concerned, a necessary way of keeping the public finances stable, people started losing trust in the coin. And over time, they didn't really want to be paid in the denarius because they realized it was being devalued. What that led to was soldiers not wanting to get paid, or soldiers wanting more money or more coins now because each coin had less value. That created a bit of military unrest. People went back to a bartering system, started trading wheat and corn and agricultural product instead, which again meant less faith in and less desire for the coin. The other thing that happened then is the taxes went up in order to, again, deal with this deficit. And what many Romans did is just left Rome. They moved to other smaller places where tax collection was more difficult. Reminds me of what's happening today, actually, in some places. But people moved to kind of smaller cities, smaller towns, just to get away from the big cities where they're not going to be taxed. And this basically hollowed Rome out. And over time, Rome basically collapsed. So essentially, I'm not saying this was the only reason, but this is a big factor in why Rome collapsed, essentially. And it's interesting, and that's a very interesting, a very powerful example. And again, if you read history about the Roman Empire and why it collapsed, money is not mentioned often in most history books, but actually money was a big role in why the debasement of this denarii was a big reason why the Roman Empire collapsed. And there's a joke going around about men think about the Roman Empire every day, isn't there? Have you seen that meme about men think about Roman Empire every day? I was presenting this in Latvia, I mentioned that on stage, but I heard another one which is that when you get to 40, all men had developed one obsession. It's either the Roman Empire or World War II. And one of those two things men get into. I've been going through a Roman Empire phase, but anyway, so that was one of the reasons why the Roman Empire collapsed. Now, in contrast to that, the Byzantine Empire or Constantinople, or the Eastern, the Holy Roman Empire in the East, remained stable during a long period of time because, again, they didn't debase their currency. So their gold-based coin stayed stable for about 700 years. It wasn't debased, which means people wanted that coin, which means they could trade with people. That led to economic growth, economic stability. That led to political stability. And as we know, Constantinople, for those history buffs, endured for another 1,000 years. However, because Constantinople was such a desirable location, what is now Istanbul, there were so many attempts by the Seljuk Turks and others to try to attack it. Over time, that led to a shrinking of territories that the empire controlled, which means less tax revenue. And because they had to constantly defend themselves against all these attacks, that meant a lot of military spending. And eventually, after sort of 11th, 12th century, they all started debasing their currency as well. And eventually, obviously, the Byzantine Empire collapsed as well. So when you look at empires throughout history, money debasement is one of the key reasons why they decline. And again, this is something I didn't know about until a couple of years ago, so I was really looking into this. So money debasement and the kind of money we use and the way we treat money and basically fiscal policy plays a big role in the stability of empires, and specifically when money is debased. And this is why, and what happens is when people lose faith in their currency, they want alternatives. I went to holiday in Turkey a few years ago, and I asked someone how much something costs in lira, and they go, no, we prefer pounds. Give us pounds or euros or dollars. We don't actually want our own currency. We don't want the lira. And that's because they've lost faith in their own currency, right? So the lira has gone from, I think, 4 liras to the pound to something like 15, 16 liras to the pound over the past sort of 10 years. So you go to places where there is this hyperinflation, they don't want their own currency. They'd rather have a dollar or a pound or something. So you see this even now, people losing faith in their own currencies, the impact that has as well on economics. So let's go to the next slide, please. So here's a couple of other examples, more recent examples of debasement to, again, drive this point home about what happens when you debase money. So the Spanish Empire, following the Portuguese, was largely built on silver from the Americas. There were 2 huge silver mines in Bolivia and Mexico, I believe. And this is what the Spanish Empire was built on, is going there, getting that silver, killing a lot of locals, I guess, and bringing it back to Europe and doing grand building projects. So the Spanish Empire was built on this kind of smuggling of silver. And the British Empire was actually began by attacking Spanish ships coming back from Latin America with silver. So it began as a kind of a pirate exhibition. That's how we got started with colonialism. But what happened over time was the Spanish didn't invest in domestic industry, didn't really industrialize Spain in the way, the Rhine Valley region in Germany or in Britain or the north of Britain was industrialized. So the Spanish relied very heavily on imports from Northern Europe to maintain its economy. Over time, the mines got depleted. There was less silver, so they had to debase their currency again. They were heavily dependent on imports, and ships were being attacked. Debt started building up, and that led to pretty much the decline of the Spanish Empire. That's how it happened, again, through the money debasement, but also over-reliance on specific mines. The more pertinent example, and the example that's sort of still with us, is a more recent history example of the Weimar Republic. So I'm not going to go into World War I because I tried to study World War I years ago, and I realized it's one of the most complex wars in the world to ever study. So I still don't know fully what happened. I even visited the Imperial War Museum and read all the exhibitions and thought, what's going on? Well, how did this start? It's a strange war. It's a very strange war. But anyway, the war finished, and the Allies blamed the Central Powers, or specifically Germany, the Weimar Republic, on starting the war. In order to fund the war, the Weimar Republic printed massive amounts of money. It wasn't backed by anything. Then there were reparations to be paid after the war. That led to massive hyperinflation. So it got to the point where people would burn the money just to keep themselves warm in the winter. There's photos of people using money as wallpaper, because that's how the Reichsmark lost so much value after World War I. And what we all know what happened straight after that. A man called Adolf Hitler came along and said, this is, we've been humiliated by the Western powers. He used this period of hyperinflation to blame Jewish bankers, kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, or to blame Western powers, and blame sort of. So he used that sense of humiliation the Germans were feeling during the period of hyperinflation to build support for Nazism. So the rise of Hitler and the rise of Nazism was also directly linked to the hyperinflation experienced by the Weimar Republic, which again was directly linked to money printing, which is to fund wars and obviously to fund reparations. So you see, there's a lot of examples of this. I'm not going to give too many examples. There's a lot of examples in history of hyperinflation to fund military campaigns. This has been one of the main reasons why people have gone on massive money printing sprees. Even in America recently with the Iraq war and the Afghanistan wars, they were largely funded by money, massive money printing, which leads to massive inflation. So there's many examples historically of how debasement to fund wars and military campaigns eventually leads to economic collapse. And these obviously, and in this case, the rise of extremism and Nazism in Germany, which obviously led to World War II. So this is very important to remember. This has been a very important, this is money printing and money debasement has played a very, very important role in human history and global events in ways that we don't fully understand, or fully appreciate, I should say. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned gold and silver and how gold and silver became the sort of de facto money throughout a lot of human history. Now, Florence was the center of finance in Europe, was the first place in Europe to develop a sort of reputation as a center of finance. When Marco Polo went to China, he came back and talked about something called paper money. The Chinese were using paper money, which is basically a trust-based system. I'm going to give you a piece of paper in return for goods that I want from you. The paper itself is not worth anything, but if you take the paper to a specific place, they'll give you something of value, gold, silver, etc. Right? So it was a trust-based system built on paper. So Florence pioneered this in Europe for the first time. So banks set up by the Medici family, people who were very rich and built Florence largely, got rich off this whole scheme. They essentially realized that although most people have gold or silver and precious metals, they don't really want to, they're worried about it being robbed, right? You're worried about going to the market with a bag full of gold coins because you're obviously a robbery target. You're worried about keeping massive amounts of gold in your house because, people know you've got gold and you're rich, they're going to come and invade and kill you and steal all your gold. So essentially they offered a gold storage facility where you leave your gold with us in a very secure location where no one can rob it. And in return, we'll give you a piece of paper, which will say you own this gold. So you then, if you want to buy something, you just give that piece of paper to the person you're buying from, and they can come and collect the gold, right? That's basically how paper money started in Florence. And what they realized over time was no one was actually coming to collect the gold. People were happy to just keep circulating the same pieces of paper that was represented gold, right? And then this led to what's called fractional reserve banking, where essentially you can issue more paper than there is gold, because no one's really coming back for the gold. So you can keep issuing paper, essentially, right? So more paper can be issued than actual gold. But if you peg paper to the gold, right, that keeps the system somewhat stable. So Florence pioneered this system, essentially, and got very rich on the back of it. And it became the Florian. So if you go to Hungary, the currency is still called the Florian. And this is the note that was issued in Florence at the time. And even the Dutch money was called the florin. Before they had the guilder, obviously now the euro. So this is how paper money started. Governments around the world, well, certainly around Europe, Bank of England, Bank of France, etc., standardized their money, issued paper backed by gold as well. And that became the de facto system because it was a more stable system, I guess. So even though there was the money was pegged to the gold in theory, in practice, there's of discretionary issuance. So, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, we printed a lot more paper than there was actual gold to fund that war, because that led to hyperinflation. France had a similar problem during wars and during the times they had the economic crisis. They had to essentially sell land. They had to sell the Louisiana Purchase, for example, which is most of sort of Central America, central part of the USA, I suppose, in order to fund their projects, but again, had to issue more and more paper money in order to keep themselves going. So it was issuance that were not pegged to gold exactly, right? So that went on for a while, but this essentially led to the fiat era. Now, the fiat era, sort of post-World War II, is really important to understand because that obviously led to the situation we're in now and led to the emergence of Bitcoin. So after World War II, what happened during World War II was a lot of European countries are worried about the Nazis seizing their gold, especially the French and the Swiss, particularly. So what they did is they transferred a lot of the gold to America to keep it safe and away from any possible Nazi seizure. This led to a situation where, and by the way, before I go into that, one of the Hitler's plans that was only discovered after World War II was the Nazis had printed a lot of British pounds, right? The whole warehouse full. There was a plan for the Luftwaffe to just drop the pounds all over Britain, right? So just flood Britain with British pounds, and that would lead to a collapse in the pound and a collapse of the British economy. They would win the war that way. They never got around to executing that, but that was one of the plans that was learned after the war. So even from their experience of hyperinflation during the Weimar years, they'd recognized the power of money to keep a country stable, right? So that was one of the war tactics that never got executed. But anyway, after World War II, you had a situation where most of the gold in the world, 70% of the world's gold was in the USA, right? And the USA being the main beneficiary of the war, because the USA was obviously not attacked and still relatively intact economically and militarily and infrastructure-wise. Something called the Bretton Woods Agreement was put together, where the US dollar became the global reserve currency. And the US dollar in turn was pegged to gold. And because the US had 70% of the world's gold, that was seen as a stable system to rebuild the world. So Japan, Europe, etc., was rebuilt by US money, and the US was basically the global power. And that was used to obviously keep Europe away from Soviet influences and other countries as well. What happened shortly after that was, again, we come back to wars. The Vietnam War, very expensive war. US attempt to keep China and Russia away from Vietnam because they felt that if Vietnam fell, all of Asia would fall to communism. So the Vietnam War started. Over time, the French, specifically the French and de Gaulle, came to the view that the US is abusing its role as global economic hegemon and spending more money than it's really got. So we want our gold back. So they started asking for their gold back because they felt it's not going to be, the system wasn't reliable. This led to what's called the Nixon shock. So in 1971, Nixon announced that the dollar was now going to be decoupled from gold completely, right? So you could just issue dollars and it doesn't matter how much gold you've got. Gold's got nothing to do with the money issuance anymore. This led to the modern era of fiat, right? So if we just move to the next slide, please, Uto. So from 1971, we've had a total fiat system, right? We've got a system where government creates money out of thin air pretty much. They just print pounds or dollars or euros and say, there's money. It's not really backed by anything. There's no gold or silver. There's nothing precious that backs that money. And this whole system is built on trust in the system. But when we go through history, and we look at pretty much every empire throughout history, we know one thing, that confidence doesn't last forever. Things happen, people lose confidence, right? When you lose confidence, the currency crashes or declines significantly. People look for alternatives. That speeds up the decline, and eventually the whole system comes crashing down. So the fiat system, which is a system we've all been born into and lived in and assume it's just the default and assume it's completely normal, is actually a bit of a house of cards. It's not designed to last forever. We don't know how long it will last, but it's not going to last forever. It can't last forever, essentially, because what happens is government issues or prints more and more each year. So that chart you can see there is the buying power of $100, I should say, over time. And you can see from 1971, when the decoupling happened, the Nixon shock happened, you can see the value of that pound since then. So the 1960s, the average American worker on the average American wage could buy a lovely 4-bedroom house, have 2 cars, raise a family, not have to have the partner working, and live a good life and probably have a holiday once a year. The same person today will be looking to get a house share, right? And eat some of the cheapest food available. So you can see that even though the wages haven't kept up with inflation, but that's because we've printed so much money over time, the fiat system basically eats itself. It's not a stable system. Now, the instability of the fiat system was really highlighted in 2008. Should we go to the next slide, please, Uto? So in 2008, the financial system crashed. I won't go into all the details of that, but there's a great movie called The Big Short. It's available on Netflix. Fantastic film, just as a piece of entertainment. But that film's a pretty good depiction of what really happened. It was a massive housing bubble. sub-zero, subprime mortgages were sold to people who couldn't really afford to pay them back. Interest rates changed, and the whole basic system collapsed. What happened then is a group of people who are involved in cryptography, a team of people, I think it was, but who no one really knows, but someone calling themselves Satoshi Nakamoto published a white paper online talking about a form of digital currency called Bitcoin. And the idea of Bitcoin was, we need the financial crash of 2008 has demonstrated to us that the system is not stable, right? It's not a stable system. The way governments responded to 2008 was by printing even more money, right? So we had massive inflation after 2008. Lots of money was given to banks, and the quality of life has been going downhill ever since. We haven't really recovered from 2008. We've been, pretty much in a decline ever since then. And Bitcoin was presented by the person behind it, or the people behind it, has a solution to this. So Bitcoin, if we think back to the slide we talked where we had the different qualities of money, scarcity, durability, all that stuff, right? Bitcoin is the first money in human history that doesn't have any of those inherent weaknesses, right? There's 21 million Bitcoins that can ever be created, right? So Bitcoin is something that's mined online, but you can only ever create 21 million Bitcoins. Once you get 21 million, that's all the Bitcoin that would ever exist. So just go to the next slide, please, Uto. Oh, sorry, there was a slide miss. Yeah, there you go. So I've tried to limit words on presentation. I'll go with image. So Bitcoin is the most, so the idea of money is this human experiment that's been going on for many, many years, right? Bitcoin, in my view at least, represents the final endpoint of that experiment. It represents the perfection of money, the point at which we've solved all the problems previous forms of money had, right? We've got a form of money now that's digital, which makes it highly portable. I could send a Bitcoin to Bolivia and Japan in seconds, right? So you can transport it all over the world instantly, so that it solves the portability problem. It's now widely acceptable. More people are accepting, and you look at the value of Bitcoin having gone up. It started as 0.1p, and now it's, I think, £88,000 today. So it's the fastest growing asset in human history. So it's the value's there, the acceptability is there. It's durable because it's digital. It can last forever. It's not going to erode or be eaten away or rust. It's durable. It's acceptable. It's portable. It's scarce. It fulfills all the criteria. It's secure. It fulfills all the criteria you'd want for money. So what's going to happen over time, and this is a slow process, is people will move from soft money to hard money, right? So fiat is soft money for all the reasons we've discussed, right? Governments can print more tomorrow, right? So there's no limit to how much dollars can be printed. There's no limit to how much pounds can be. Even if it's digitized, it still can be, the quantity can be increased by overnight, basically, which means the money you earn today loses value tomorrow. Whereas Bitcoin is the exact opposite. The Bitcoin you earn today increases in value tomorrow, right? And it keeps increasing. So Bitcoin represents this perfection of money because, again, security. No one can confiscate your Bitcoin. If you have Bitcoin, no one can take that away from you because you're not relying on a third party. The Bitcoin is, if you put it into cold storage, you control the Bitcoin. You have the keys to your own bank, basically. You're carrying a Swiss bank account in your pocket, as Obama said when he talked about Bitcoin. So Bitcoin solves a lot of these problems. You can access it 24/7, so you don't have to rely on a bank to be open. You can send it to anywhere in the world. It's secure. You're not relying on third parties. No one can take your Bitcoin or confiscate your Bitcoin. And no one needs to know about your Bitcoin. No one even knows if you have Bitcoin or not, right? So no one knows who has Bitcoin. So Bitcoin essentially solves all the problems that previous forms of money had. The other really important thing about Bitcoin is time preference. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Uto. Time preference is really important. So if you're earning money in something that is declining in value, you're incentivized to spend it as soon as possible because you know that the £100 you earned this year is probably going to be worth £95 next year. And in 10 years' time, it'll probably be worth £60. So I want to spend it quickly rather than spend you're not incentivized to save, right? Because it's losing value, right? Through inflation. So what that does to you psychologically is it turns you into a consumer. You see money as something to spend instantly. Let's go out and buy stuff with it. Let's go out and spend it, almost frivolously. The system is designed to encourage a consumption in that way. If you're earning money in something that's increasing in value, your time preference suddenly change. You're thinking, this Bitcoin I earn today is going to be worth probably double in 5 years' time. So maybe I'll be a bit more prudent about how I spend it, and I can start planning my future now. I could think about retirement. I could think about inheritance. I could think about what I want to give to my kids. It changes your mindset. And this is something I read about in theory, and I've been in Bitcoin for about 5 years now. And I've experienced this directly myself. Since I started buying Bitcoin, investing in Bitcoin, I've really changed how I think about money. It's really transformed the way I think about money. In a much healthier way. You think in a much more responsible way about money. Because you're thinking, should I go and splash out £200 on a big meal today because that money will be worth even more next year, maybe a bit more. It doesn't mean you become become completely stingy, but it just means you're just a bit more careful about expenditure. So it changes your mindset psychologically, I think, in a very healthy way. So is there a summary slide? Was there a summary slide at the end? Yeah. So just to summarize, there's a lot more that can be said. It's a very big topic, to summarize in 45 minutes. But essentially, just to summarize some of the key points today, which I hopefully came across clearly. Money is evolved as a tool to store and account for and exchange value. There's hard and soft money, as we talked about the different types of money. Bitcoin, certainly in my view and the view of an increasing number of people, is the hardest money ever invented. Some people have called it God money. Like it represents the perfection of the money journey. Money debasement leads to economic decline. We've seen many historical examples of that. Bitcoin can't be debased. That's why I kept emphasizing the debasement stories, because you can't debase Bitcoin. You can debase dollars, pounds, euros, gold. You can't debase Bitcoin, right? And the other crucial thing about Bitcoin is decentralization, right? So no one controls Bitcoin. There's no Bitcoin bank. There's no Bitcoin CEO. There's no Bitcoin call center. No one controls Bitcoin. It's almost like a garden that anyone can enter and enjoy the fruits of. So decentralization, what that does, it creates a level playing field. So if someone's in Kenya, and I mentioned Kenya because we do some work in Kenya, and they're owning a currency that has less value than, say, the pound, even though they're working equally hard and doing the same thing, is a bit unfair, really, isn't it? So what Bitcoin does, it creates a level playing field. So if that person's being paid in Bitcoin and I'm being paid in Bitcoin for producing the same value, then that's a fairer game, right? We're both earning the same thing because it's a fairer game. So having a global digitized currency that everyone can access without any interventions from bureaucracy or political figures or corrupt banking systems or corrupt domestic rulers in certain parts of the world, Bitcoin leads to more equality. It leads to people earning the same thing of the same value, and they can exchange it with each other of the same value, right? So globally, it creates a more level playing field, which I think over time leads to more sort of global justice and addresses a lot of the inequalities we face out there as well. There's a lot more I want to say about that, but we'll come on to that in the next week. But I'll stop there in the interest of time and hand back over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. And if we can go to the last slide, Uto, just as a closing slide for us there, just to say thank you for spending your time with us today. I hope the session gave you a real valuable perspective on the history of money, what Bitcoin is and why it matters, and that will really set us up for our next session. It's a very complex concept for people to sort of understand. So we'll be contacting you shortly to gather further questions and some feedback from yourself. Your input will absolutely help us shape the next session, and it will continue to help us to improve what we deliver. So our next webinar takes place next Thursday. Please mark it in your calendars and keep an eye on our socials. Just to remind you, we're going to hear again from Groundswell Project about how they put Bitcoin into practice. And you'll also hear from our co-founder about why EverGive exists. Thanks again for joining us today. And we absolutely look forward to seeing you next week.